Hey guys, so today we're going to talk a little bit more about the United States in the early 1800s, and we're going to talk about how it expanded with the Louisiana Purchase. But first, we have to talk about Thomas Jefferson and how his presidency helped change a little bit about the policy of the United States. So, in the year 1800, it was an election year for a new president. And that year is sometimes called a revolution because there was a change in the country. And the reason why this happened is because the voters who chose the new person as president chose a new political party. So, up until that point, all of the presidents were Federalists, starting with um, George Washington. But when the citizens chose Thomas Jefferson as president, he replaced John Adams, who would become the last Federalist president, and Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. Even though all of the political leaders, so the government officials, had different political parties, Jefferson tried his best to bring the people together. So he wanted them to still be united. And even though they had differing opinions about how to run the government, he still wanted them to kind of be peaceful and make decisions together. The Democratic Republicans started to replace the Federalists as judges. So those who were in power in the Congress, so in the House of Representatives and Senate, who were Democratic Republicans, they started to choose Democratic Republican judges to serve in the Supreme Court. There was a group of people in the House of Representatives, so the majority of them started to gain control as Democratic Republicans, and they voted to impeach the Supreme Court justice. So the judge who was in charge of the Supreme Court, which is the national group of judges, his name was Samuel Chase. He was chosen, or he was voted to be impeached. And if we remember correctly, when we talked about the government of the United States, when you impeach someone, whether it's the president or any government official, you're basically saying that you're charging them with doing something wrong in office. The only thing that Samuel Chase was doing wrong was his political views were different than the majority of people in the House of Representatives. Once the House of Representatives chooses to impeach someone, then it goes to the Senate, which is the other group of people, and they're in charge of deciding whether they impeach the person or not. So even though they didn't agree with his politics, the Senate decided to leave Chase in office because basically he didn't do a criminal act. He didn't do anything wrong in office. He just had different ideas than the rest of the government officials. So this helped establish the idea that judges could be removed only if they commit criminal acts. Same thing with presidents, same thing with other government official. And it also helped to reinforce that idea of separation of powers. So remember when we talked about the government and how each branch is in charge of one specific responsibility and they don't have more power than the other. So this helped establish that the legislative branch didn't have more power than the judicial branch. There was also a case called Marbury versus Madison. This happened in 1803, and the Supreme Court declared that it had the right to review laws passed by Congress. So remember that Congress is in charge of creating laws, and then the Supreme Court is in charge of interpreting those laws. And they declared that they had the power to decide if a law was constitutional or not. So if it didn't fit or follow the rules laid out in the Constitution, they can take that law out. The Chief Justice during this time was John Marshall, and he was the one who wrote the decision. And he was very influential because he served 34 years as the main judge in Supreme Court, and many of his decisions helped to strengthen the power of the federal government. Okay, so one of the most important events that happened during Thomas Jefferson's presidency was expanding the US West. So remember, we talked about how these 13 colonies, okay, on the map, the first original 13 colonies started to move westward with all of those trails that were discovered. The settlers were moving west towards the Appalachian Mountains. So this land was being settled by the American citizens. This land that's in white was owned by France. Okay. Thomas Jefferson wanted to make more land available for farmers, and he also wanted to take control of New Orleans. He was afraid that if other countries owned this part of the North American continent, that they would maybe close the port and Americans wouldn't be able to trade through here. So he wanted to take control just of this little section, okay, just this city of New Orleans, just so that he can have access to the Gulf of Mexico down here and be able to trade by ship. So in 1803, he asked the French government, he offered to buy New Orleans for $10 million, okay? But France was currently in a war with Great Britain, and they needed money to pay for the war. So they decided to offer all of the Louisiana territory. So down here, which was borders of Mexico, okay, all the way up to Canada. This is where the Mississippi River runs. And then over here is the start of the Rocky Mountains. So this entire piece of land was what France was willing to sell to the United States to help fund their war. Remember that the US only wanted the city of New Orleans, but France offered them the entire Louisiana territory. So they asked the United States, how much are you willing to buy it for? And the United States decided to purchase it for $15 million. So they were going to originally purchase just one city for $10 million, but they ended up buying 530 million acres of land for $15 million. And in today's money, it's about $200 million, which for the amount of land that they got is not very expensive. This is super important because the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. So if you can see, this is what the United States was before, and now the United States is all of this land. Okay, so including the white and then this yellow part over here. Before, Jefferson wasn't really a fan of the Constitution because he thought that it limited the power of the national government, so it didn't give them a lot of power to make decisions. But he also knew that this purchase was a great opportunity. So now he kind of changed his mind and said anything was constitutional as long as it didn't say you couldn't do it in the Constitution. So the Senate quickly approved the Louisiana Purchase, and on December 20th of 1803, the United States rose an American flag over New Orleans. So now that all that new land is pretty much unknown, okay? It stretched so far west that no one had already explored that territory before. So Thomas Jefferson decided to hire explorers Lewis and Clark to look through that area. So it was their job to kind of look for resources, what kind of land there were, all kinds of things. They looked for men to join their expedition. So Lewis and Clark hired other men to go along with them on the expedition, and they also took an enslaved African American with them. The purpose of it was to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. So remember, we talked way back in class about the Northwest Passage. The United States also wanted to find the Northwest Passage. So if they had access to all of this land, they were hoping to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. They also wanted to gather information, like I mentioned, about the land, what kind of resources were available, and also which natives lived in that region. So in May of 1804, Lewis and Clark went west from St. Louis. So they started here in St. Louis, which is in Missouri, and they followed this trail. Along the way, in 1805, they were joined by Sacagawea, and this was a Native American woman who was also an interpreter. So she spoke many languages, and she helped the two men on their expedition. Um, they traveled 8,000 miles, and most of them were along native trails. They also followed native maps, and they were led by native guides. So the Native Americans helped Lewis and Clark a lot on this expedition, and thanks to them, they were able to explore all of this. They crossed the Rocky Mountains. They also followed the Columbia River, which is here, and they finally ended up in the Pacific Ocean. So this expedition was successful. They returned a year later back to St. Louis in 1806. And here's a picture of them too with Sacagawea. This map here is super important for the assignment that you're gonna do today. So please make sure to look over the information here. Other explorers were also hired to look through and explore the new territory. In 1805, we had an explorer named Zebulon Pike who looked for the source of the Mississippi River. And the source of it is like the beginning of it. So his job was to find the beginning of the Mississippi River, but he didn't find it. He also took another expedition and he explored the Rocky Mountains. But he was not successful climbing the mountains. But there is a section of the Rocky Mountains that are named after him. And that's his picture, and this is the map he followed. Okay, also in Thomas Jefferson's presidency, he had to handle problems with other countries that arose. So remember we talked about how France and Great Britain were at war. Both countries wanted the United States support. So they wanted the United States to help them in the war. But the United States didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to take sides, but they also wanted to continue trading with both countries. So they said, we're not going to get involved in the fighting, but we do want to continue doing business with you. So France and Great Britain didn't like this. Instead, what they decided to do is they would take over American ships and they would kind of kidnap the crew. They would fight with them. Great Britain would stop the ships and they would look for British soldiers because the soldiers would desert the Navy and they would kind of join the Americans and act as they were American citizens. Even though sometimes they didn't find British citizens, they would take American citizens and claim that they were still ruled by Great Britain because Great Britain had ruled them before the American Revolution. They also would make American sailors serve on British ships, and this practice is called impressment. So because there were so many negative things going on with trading, Thomas Jefferson asked Congress to pass the Embargo Act in 1807, and this law closed all the American ports, so the ships couldn't leave or enter American harbors, and it really affected the economy because the Americans were not allowed to ship or trade with other countries anymore. And even though they didn't want to get involved in the war, eventually we are going to talk about how they had no choice and they did get involved in the war with the Great Britain and France. Okay, so for your assignment, I attached this PDF, and what you see is a map of the United States. And what your job is you're going to color in the United States. So color in the United States that was originally the United States in one color, Then you're going to color the Louisiana Purchase in a different color. And then the rest of the map, just leave it blank because we didn't really talk about who owned those territories. Then you're going to draw the route that Lewis and Clark took on their journey and then answer those 4 questions. You can do all of it on the PDF, or if you want to create a new Google Doc or write it in your notebook and then submit a picture, you can do that too. Okay. I also uploaded the Google Slides. So if you want to review the slides on your own and review this slide that we talked about so you can see the map a little bit clearer, you can do that. It's available under the Social Studies tab. Okay. Tomorrow we'll talk about how the Americans got involved with the war and what the consequence or what the results of that were. Okay, so we'll talk to you later.